In Buddhism, there is a lot of talk about the term dukkha, and it often is translated into suffering, which is a quite heavy and gloomy topic. But I think if we're honest, that's actually the reason why most of us are engaged in practice, whether it's mindfulness practice or something else, is that we have a deep recognition that there's suffering in our lives. And we have a commitment and a willingness to relieve that suffering to whatever extent possible. So it's in that context that I find this metaphor of the two arrows to be quite practical and useful frame for us to use. So it's clear that being hit by one arrow is better than being hit by two arrows. It's going to be less painful. One wound is better than two wounds. But what does this actually mean? So what do these two arrows represent? Well, so the first arrow, it represents the pain of our lives. This can be as simple as an injury that I have. I have a pain in my shoulder, for example. Or it can be some loss in my life, the loss of a loved one. It can be a stressful situation at work. It can be a conflict that I have, or it can be maybe losing my job. So any type of situation or circumstance or thing in my life that is disagreeable, that is painful, that I don't want. This is the pain of life. Now the second arrow is the psychological pain. This is the pain that we add on to the first arrow. This is our storytelling and our interpretation of that pain, which is added unnecessarily on top of the first arrow. This is the dukkha. This is the suffering in our lives. So let's take an example. Let's say that you wake up one morning and you look at your alarm clock, or more likely your phone, and you get a shock because you've overslept. You realize that you're 90 minutes late or something like this. This is painful. You get this oh shit experience. This is the first arrow, essentially. This is like, you're a samurai in the battlefield and you suddenly get hit by an arrow. You get pierced by an arrow. And in this instant, you're presented with a choice. So what often happens is that we react to this pain, to this situation. We resist it. There's a resistance, and we often go on telling stories about it. So in the example, we might, say this shitty alarm clock, I can't believe that it's not working, it's the worst thing ever. Or I can't believe how stupid I am for forgetting my alarm, or whatever it is. And this goes on into storytelling. So now we realize that we won't be able to have that breakfast that we were hoping for. Our whole day is disrupted. Or maybe even worse, we miss this very important appointment that we had. So all the work that went into preparation for that meeting is now wasted, and maybe we won't be able to perform in the project at work now because of this, and our boss will notice, and maybe we won't get that promotion that we were hoping for. Maybe we will even get fired. This storytelling just goes on and on. This is the second arrow. This is the psychological pain that we add on top of the first arrow, right? So in the case of the samurai, he starts obsessing over the pain, maybe looking for who shot the arrow, what was the reason for the arrow being shot, planning his revenge and so on, and obsessing over the fact that he's been struck by the first arrow, obviously making him an easy target for that second arrow to hit. So this is often what's happening. But if we rewind back to this choice that I mentioned, and first of all, let's make it clear that we don't have a choice when it comes to the first arrow. We cannot change the past. We cannot go back and make sure that the alarm would go off. So the choice does not have to do with the first arrow. The choice presents itself when we're hit. This is the point. And the choice is one between resisting and accepting. There's a choice between reacting unconsciously or responding wisely. It's a choice between working with reality and working against reality. So this is very related to the concept of acceptance, which we talked about elsewhere. So I won't go into details here, but it's important to reiterate that acceptance is not about agreeing or consenting or liking what's happening. It's just a matter of actually being clear with the reality of what's happening and then working with reality rather than working against reality. So in the example, if I look at my alarm clock, it's not that I am happy that I overslept, but it is a recognition that this is now reality. So perhaps I'm able to take a few deep breaths and get out of bed and get on with my day and trying to make the best of the circumstances. Or in the example of the samurai in the battlefield, recognizing that he's hit with this arrow, getting a clear perspective on the situation, what's happening, and then moving into shelter, moving aside and watching the second arrow fly by. So this is obviously easier said than done. And I think it's important to point out here that this is not a sort of moral judgment that, we deserve to suffer because we choose to suffer. It's more about a sort of invitation that there is a signpost, pointing us in the direction of this is the path away from suffering. And this is the path that leads into the battlefield and where additional arrows await. This is not like flipping a switch, that overnight we all of a sudden stop reacting, stop creating psychological suffering for ourselves, and then we're free of suffering. This is a lifelong process, and that's why we're practicing, right? And it's also important to recognize that we don't always have the choice. Sometimes we're not in that position. We're not in a position where we can accept the circumstances as they are. But it's also not a binary situation where either we are able to accept it and be fine with it, or we get the second arrow. Obviously, sometimes we have a small reaction, sometimes we have a large reaction, but the point is that it's all workable and that it's possible to actually practice and move on the path that leads us away from suffering. And actually, if you think about it, there are situations or circumstances when you're actually able to shrug your shoulders and say, shit happens, let's make the best of it. And then there are situations in which you can't. And that's the practice. That's where the practice comes in. So the process here is, first of all, that we need a commitment or a desire to relieve suffering for ourselves and for others. We need this desire to actually walk on the path away from the battlefield. That's the first thing. The second thing is being aware, recognizing when we're hit with the first arrow, recognizing when we have a choice. The choice presents itself when we run into these inevitable painful situations in our lives. And from there, we can work with acceptance, which can then afford us to actually respond wisely to the circumstances rather than reacting unconsciously. So I hope you found this helpful. And just to reiterate, this is not meant as a beautiful parable or a nice philosophical concept. It's more like a frame that can be translated into practice. It's something that can actually be effective and actually helpful in your life. So I really encourage you to take this frame and sort of install it into your mind and try it out and see, does it actually help me? Does it lead me away from suffering?